So we're now tonight we're delighted to welcome Samantha Hall-Saladino. I hope I said that name right. Yeah, I did. She is the executive director of the Fulton County Historical Society in Gloversville, New York, and she serves as also the Fulton County historian. She received her BA in History and English from Russell Sage College and then a Master's in Museum Studies from the University of New Hampshire. She is the secretary for the Association of Public Historians of New York State, and she's also a member of the board of directors for the Museum Association of New York. So somehow, with all of that, she has found time to prepare this fantastic presentation for us on A Bit of Heaven, Irish Immigration to Fulton County. So I'm absolutely thrilled. We talked about doing this a couple of weeks ago when we were at the Museum Association's conference up in Corning in New York. So welcome, Samantha, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I had an absolute blast putting this together. I actually learned a lot myself. So this was good all around, I think. So welcome everybody. Thanks for having me.
We just need your camera on, Samantha.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
And I'm going to mute myself and take myself out of it. But if those of you who are present, you can use the Q&A or the chat feature down here, or just hover on your screen to ask a question at the end. So thank you.
All right, I'm just going to start by giving a little bit of introduction to who the Fulton County Historical Society is. This is us. We're located at 237 Kingsborough Ave in Gloversville. We are in the old Kingsborough Elementary School. Our building was constructed in 1900. And this year is actually our 70th anniversary. We were established in 1952. So we're very excited that we are still in our community and still sharing and preserving our history. Just a little bit about our exhibits. We have military history, FJ&G Railroad, the Fonda, Johnstown, and Gloversville Railroad, for those of you who are railroad history buffs. Of course, the leather and glove industry, which we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. Firefighting and the history of our police force and all kinds of stuff. We have a great textile collection, so if you're a quilter or you love clothing, please come and visit us. There's something for everyone, and I'll talk about when you can come and do that at the end of the presentation. So this year, as the Fulton County Historical Society celebrates our 70th anniversary, as I mentioned, our special exhibit and programming is focusing on the history of immigration to Fulton County. For those of you who might not be familiar with our area, we are located about an hour north of Albany, in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. If you're familiar with the Great Sacandaga Lake, that's where we are. Our two major cities, Gloversville and Johnstown, along with the surrounding hamlets, towns, and villages, were once considered the glove capital of the world. Almost 90% of the world's gloves were made in the area at the height of the industry in the early 20th century. And the people that built this industry, that worked in its factories and its tanneries and sewed gloves at home, were immigrants and the children of immigrants. English, French, Irish, Scottish, German, and Eastern European Jews, Italians, Dutch, people from all over the world were drawn to this area for its economic potential. But tonight we're going to focus, of course, on the Irish who made Fulton County their home. And we're going to do this by looking at two different historical pieces of Fulton County. The life of Sir William Johnson and the 19th century agricultural Irish settlement at Oppenheim. These are just some images from the glove industry that we have showing the different levels of work that went on. You could see that most of the people who sewed gloves were women, and most of the men who cut the gloves, or most of the people who cut the gloves were men. And then, of course, the men were working in the tanneries. So William Johnson was born about 1715 in County Meath, Ireland. It's the dark green county there. His mother, Anne Warren, was descended from a family of Old English Catholic gentry. Previous generations had lost much of their status to Protestant English colonists. The Johnson branch were Jacobites, supportive of restoring the House of Stuart to the British throne. And though the Warrens were Catholic, Anne's brother Peter was raised Protestant to allow him to pursue a career in the British Navy, where he achieved success and accumulated wealth. While not extravagantly wealthy, the Johnsons enjoyed a comfortable life in Smithstown, and this is actually the Johnson family home. These photos were taken by Juan and Rhonda Birch, who are involved with the Johnson Hall State Historic Site. These are posted on their Facebook. They have a bunch of other cool pictures of the property, so if you are interested in seeing more of that, their home in Ireland, you can check out the Johnson Hall Facebook page. So in his early 20s, William was asked by his uncle Peter to travel to the colonies, where he had just purchased a large tract of land along the southern side of the Mohawk River in New York. And there is Uncle Peter Warren. Understanding that there were limited opportunities for advancement for Catholics in the British Empire, and never being particularly religious, Johnson too converted to Protestantism and set sail for New York in 1738. He arrived at the place called Warrensbush with 12 other Irish Protestant families. Johnson was tasked with clearing the land and establishing his uncle's new settlement, with the implication that he would eventually inherit much of it. Along with the new arrivals, Johnson purchased several enslaved Africans to do the hard labor of clearing the forested land. And these were the first enslaved people that Johnson owned, and he would go on to own slaves for the rest of his life, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Encouraged by his uncle to become involved in the trade with the local Native Americans, Johnson soon discovered that the trade routes were actually on the opposite side of the river from his uncle's settlement. So that red trail that you see going from Albany to Fort Oswego and Fort Niagara, I pointed out where Montgomery County is. And this is where the land that Peter Warren owned was located. So you could see it went directly through the land that through Warrensbush. So within a year, and to the annoyance of his uncle Peter, Johnson purchased a house and farm on the northern shore and built a sawmill and a store. He called his settlement Mount Johnson. And from here, he had direct access to the trade routes, and his store did great business in supplying the traders along the way to Fort Oswego. Johnson was also able to purchase furs from them and sell directly to New York City merchants, cutting out the middlemen in Albany. So this, of course, did not endear Johnson to the wealthy Dutch businessmen downriver, who were furious. And of course, it also further annoyed his uncle Peter. There was no love lost between Johnson and Albany. References to the Dutch and their perceived unscrupulous ways are littered throughout the Johnson papers. In a letter to Cadwallader Colden in 1761, Johnson wrote, quote, "There is no justice to be expected by any Englishman in this country, nor never will, whilst the bench of judges and justices is composed entirely of Dutch," underscoring the partiality, cruelty, and oppression of those in authority here who call themselves the Dutch. A letter to Johnson from Whittam Marsh the following fall, called the Dutch Rascals, and an earlier letter to Johnson from John Lynn read, quote, "I have no news to write you from this remote place, only to acquaint you that I thought since the rebellion in Scotland, the devil had been a Scotchman, but I find him to be a Dutchman." So you can see there was some tension there. Prior to the early 1600s, the population of the Mohawk tribe in the area numbered nearly 8,000, but by the time Johnson arrived, it had dwindled to 580. I apologize, this image is not good. It looked good on my screen, but blown up, it does not look good. The decline was caused by infectious diseases brought by European colonizers and warfare with competing tribes in the lucrative beaver trade. Johnson became closely associated with the Mohawk, learning the language and their customs. For their part, the Mohawk felt an alliance with Johnson would help to advance their interest with the British crown. And in 1742, they made him an honorary sachem and bestowed upon him the name Warragiagi, which was translated as a man who undertakes great things. This was an alliance and a relationship that would last the rest of Johnson's life. King George's War began in 1744, and within 2 years, Johnson was appointed as New York Indian agent, replacing the Albany-based commissioners. He was instructed with enlisting and supplying colonists and Native Americans for a campaign against the French. Then this is another image of Sir William Johnson on the right. It was here that Johnson's positive relationship with the Mohawk began to produce results for the British. He worked with Mohawk Chief Hendrick Theonogwin, who is on the left, a leader with the Bear Clan and Canajoharie, to recruit Mohawk warriors. They organized raiding parties against the French and their native allies, and Johnson paid bounties for scalps, even though he understood this encouraged the scalping of non-combatants of all ages. At the end of the war in 1748, Johnson built a new stone house on his land, which he called Fort Johnson. You can see it here today, and moved the council meeting place from Albany to this new location. He also purchased homes in Schenectady and Albany where he could stay on his trips to and from New York. And still serving as agent, Johnson found himself caught between two political factions in Albany. There was Governor George Clinton, who wanted the New York Assembly to repay Johnson's war expenses, which was a sum of £2,000. But another group led by Lieutenant Governor James Delancey, who was friends with the Indian commissioners that Johnson had replaced, blocked him at every turn. And to complicate things even further, Delancey was Peter Warren's brother-in-law, putting more strain on the relationship between uncle and nephew. When Warren died in 1752, he left Johnson nothing in his will except for the requirement that he must pay back all of the expenses he incurred while settling Warren's land. Frustrated with his situation, Johnson resigned as commissioner. Unhappy with Johnson's resignation, Chief Hendrick led a Mohawk delegation to New York City to tell the governor that the covenant chain, which was the diplomatic relationship between the Iroquois and the British, had been broken. And the only way to fix it was to reinstate Johnson as their agent. So he retook the role at the start of the French and Indian War, and Major General Edward Braddock appointed Johnson as his agent to the Haudenosaunee. Though Johnson had no military experience, he was commissioned as a major general and instructed to lead an expedition against the French at Crown Point. So this is just a map from the Library of Congress showing the location of Crown Point. You could see the fort up in the top there at the edge of the little peninsula. Upon his arrival north, Johnson renamed Lac du Saint-Sacrement to Lake George in honor of his king. During the Battle of Lake George on September 8th, 1755, Johnson was wounded by a ball in either the hip or the thigh, and the piece of metal would remain in his body for the rest of his life. The British victory at Lake George earned Johnson the status of war hero. He was given £5,000 by Parliament and the title of baronet by the king. Johnson instructed and oversaw the building of Fort William Henry, which he established to help protect the northern frontier. In 1756, Johnson was appointed as sole superintendent of Indian affairs and reported directly to London, as this was considered part of the military department. So he was no longer burdened with having to deal with different provincial governments, which made his job much easier. As he was most knowledgeable about the Haudenosaunee, especially the Mohawk, he made them the focus of his diplomacy, promoting them and himself as much as possible. Johnson was no longer a general, but continued to lead Iroquois and frontier militia during the war. The war was going poorly for the British at this point, making it very difficult for Johnson to recruit native allies. They were understandably hesitant about joining a losing cause, but within a year, the tide shifted and Johnson was able to continue his recruitment efforts. In the summer of 1758, Johnson led a contingent of 1,000 Native American warriors under General John Prideaux in the attack at Fort Niagara. When Prideaux died during the battle, Johnson took over the command and led the British and their native allies to victory. He was present at the capture of Montreal in 1760, and with the war over, he and his deputy, George Crowan, spent a lot of time negotiating with the former Indian allies of the French. After the war, Johnson spent much of his time expanding and improving his land holdings. He had accumulated some 170,000 acres by the time of his death, and they say he was surpassed only by the Penn and Rensselaer families in land ownership. Perhaps the most well-known of these tracts is the 80,000 acres given to him by the Mohawk of Canajoharie, located north of the Mohawk River. And it was on this land that he established Johnstown in 1762, named for his son John. He established a school at the Crown's expense for white and Mohawk children, as well as an Anglican church, and set about recruiting tenants to live in his new village. So the church is St. John's. This was the second church that was built on the left-hand side when they realized they needed a larger space. And this burnt in the 19th century, and the new St. John's Church was constructed. That's on the right-hand side. It is still there today. I grew up going to that church. So it's a very beautiful building. If you ever get a chance to see the inside, it's really, really nice in there. He allowed his Catholic tenants to worship on the estate, but he hoped that they would convert. And this was actually a pattern that he had for any other tenants that he recruited to come and live at Johnstown. He never really pressured them to convert to join St. John's Church, but it was his hope that they would eventually become members. In 1772, they created Tryon County from Albany, named for the governor at the time, William Tryon, and Johnstown would become the county seat, and Johnson would build a courthouse and a jail. The image on the left is an older etching of the courthouse. Originally, that small building was not there. That was the county clerk's office at one point. And then on the right-hand side, we have our courthouse today. We're actually celebrating the 250th anniversary of the courthouse this year. In September, we have quite a few events planned. The New York State Court of Appeals will be hearing cases there on September 8th, which they've never done before. And then that weekend, we'll be having a few events with the Johnstown Historical Society in collaboration with the county itself. So keep an eye out if you're interested in the history of legal history in New York, or just enjoy coming to local history events. Those will be posted online. And then this is the jail. The original jail building was just that stone part in the middle there. It was fortified during the Revolution and used as a fort. It was used as a county jail until the new one was built out on Route 29. And today it houses the county personnel and planning department. So it is still in use. The letters from Johnson's family back home were filled with requests for him to write more often or to even visit. These are really kind of a joy to read. One letter from a friend to Dear Billy exclaimed that he, quote, expected before now to be happy here with your many promises of seeing old Ireland, but finds New York ladies have greater influence than could be expected in this country of ours. Many of the early tenants in Johnstown were from Ireland. Friends often wrote to him with requests from people they knew who wanted to settle on his land. So, for example, in 1768, a farmer near Belfast promised that he could bring 40 more Irish families to follow him if Johnson would allow him to settle near him. Others passed along words of families who would be useful to the new settlement, blacksmiths, gardeners, anything that they felt would be useful to a prospering settlement. So George Crone wrote of several servants that he found in Dublin, including a married gardener that he hoped would be an addition to the fruitful Johnson Hall. By the fall of 1772, Johnson was no longer desperate for settlers, and he could choose to be a little bit more picky. So there was a letter regarding a group of Northern Irish who wanted to come to Johnstown, and he wrote, I have no longer occasion to be at any trouble or expense for their settlement, but if his terms were agreeable, he shall most willingly accommodate as many of my countrymen as I can. Apparently, the number of Irish leaving for the colonies was a cause of concern for Parliament at this point. Johnson's brother Warren wrote on October 5th, 1773, we have no news at present, but everybody expects this session of Parliament will be very warm, and an act applied for to prevent so many of the Irish from going to America. So I tried to look into this a little bit because I thought that was kind of an interesting statement. And it seems that Parliament had been considering restricting Irish immigration, but chose to study this situation before making any decisions. But of course, 1773, the revolution is looming on the horizon. And so this issue lost much of its immediate relevance in the colonies. I mentioned before that Johnson purchased enslaved people upon arriving at Warrensbush to help clear the land, and he continued to use slave labor for the rest of his life. Slavery began in New York in 1626 and continued after the English captured the city in 1664. As colonists pushed farther up and across the Hudson and Mohawk rivers into Haudenosaunee territory, they brought enslaved people with them. And a total number of people enslaved by Johnson is difficult to determine, but approximately 40 names appeared in documents just between 1738 and 1744. There were some names appearing in the 1770s that included sisters Jenny and Juba, Harry, Jobo, Hester, Abram, Cork, Jemmy, Jacob, Cato, Charlie, Pontiac, and Betty. And these were common names in the British Caribbean. The Johnson papers also include a number of references to slavery, including letters from agents who sought and purchased enslaved people in New York City for Johnson, and orders for things like Osnaburg, which was a cheap cloth made from hemp or flax that was used to make clothing for slaves. They also included at least one order for handcuffs. In his letter to his future son-in-law, Daniel Claus, Johnson lists 2 enslaved men who have been afflicted by smallpox. You can see it's just sort of a postscript on a longer letter, with Kitchener, who is passed away, in Quaco, who also did eventually die. He called them his flock, which I took to suggest that his concerns were more about the epidemic, were more economic, more financial impact of losing so many enslaved people from this illness. Enslaved people on Johnson's estate may have lived in a number of different locations on the ground. This is an excerpt from the inventory of Johnson Hall after Johnson's death, and indicates that they had use of at least one room in the West Stone blockhouse. At other times, there may have been living quarters on the bank along the river, along the creek into Johnstown. But as you can see, their belongings were minimal and simple. They included things that were old and no longer used to the family. Johnson Hall just recently, within the past few years, spent a lot of effort in redoing that West Stone house and interpreting the history of enslaved people at Johnson Hall. And I think they actually have an upcoming program on that within the next month or so, I think. So it's definitely worth a visit if you haven't been to Johnson Hall, or if you haven't been recently. They've been doing a lot of work, and there's a lot more to see. In her research on slavery at Johnson Hall, the former site manager Wanda Birch writes, quote, Johnson avoided Indian slaves called Pawnees, complaining that he could not force them to work. Occasionally, he was obligated to accept them as pledges against a Six Nations promise, but found an opportunity to pass them on to someone else as quickly as possible. The enslaved people at Johnson's estate were overseen by Thomas Flood, one of his Irish tenants. Unfortunately, Flood had problems with alcoholism and was often drunk, which made him a harsh overseer. In a letter to Johnson, which was destroyed by fire but was listed in his calendar of letters that he received, Flood wrote from Johnson's summer home at Castle Cumberland on the Sacandaga River, where he casually tossed in his letter about haying and harvesting and the poor prospect of grain, the fact that he had flogged some of the enslaved people. Because the letter is lost, we don't know the reason why, and it appears that Johnson did not reply to this. The number of enslaved people in post-revolutionary Fulton County ranged from 80 people in 1790 to 271 in 1820. And of course, New York State chose to introduce gradual abolition, a process that began in 1781 and didn't fully materialize until 1827. After the death of his first wife, a German indentured servant named Catherine Weisenberg, Johnson entered into a common law marriage with a Mohawk woman called Molly Brandt. Unfortunately, we don't have any likenesses of her. This was a stamp that was done in Canada commemorating her. And we do have her signature here on the left-hand side. She eventually did flee Johnson Hall during the American Revolution, bringing with her some of the enslaved people that I listed before previously. And she was really his partner in a lot of the goings on at Johnson Hall, which the hall itself was a meeting place of different cultures and languages. It was a bustling mixing pot of domestic and business life, where council gatherings brought hundreds of Haudenosaunee to the grounds. This is an image or a painting, sorry, of what that might have looked like, done by the artist Edward Lamson Henry. And it was during one such gathering on July 11th, 1774, that Johnson suffered a stroke and died. As the American Revolution reached Tryon County, his son, John, Molly, and the rest of the Loyalist household, which I mentioned included several enslaved people, fled to Canada in fear of their safety. Sir William Johnson was a complicated man. All historical figures are. Though his relationship with the Haudenosaunee was mostly positive, he did use his influence among them to benefit himself, even exploiting them if necessary to grow his own power and wealth. He's actually buried on the grounds of St. John's Episcopal Church in Johnstown, which is the church he established. You could see his memorial there outside the church. And he was arguably one of the most influential figures in New York's colonial era, and certainly in Fulton County. I know a lot of us like to think, what if Johnson hadn't died right at the start of the American Revolution? What would it have looked like here? What would have been different? Of course, we don't know, but it is something. His influence was so great that it is something that we like to think about sometimes. So after the war, Tryon County became Montgomery County. Get rid of those royal names, and we'll take on Montgomery County, who was named after General Richard Montgomery, killed at the Battle of Quebec. New waves of immigrants came through, especially a large contingent from New England, who established the settlement of Kingsborough that would eventually become the city of Gloversville. And as the glove and tanning industry grew, people started coming to the area even more, drawn by the promise of steady work. The mid-19th century saw a large number of Irish immigrants settle not in the cities of Gloversville or Johnstown, but in a small rural commune in the town of Oppenheim. Historians Daniel J. Casey and F. Daniel Larkin found that the Irish contributed significantly to the development of rural American culture, right? We like to think a lot of times they came to the cities and that's where they stayed. But in the 1840s and 50s, Irish immigrant families began buying land in western Fulton County. And this was still mostly forested land that hadn't been cleared. So you can see it's on the border of Oppenheim, which is a town in Fulton County, western Fulton County. And where the arrow is pointing, it says RC Church, Roman Catholic Church, which we'll talk about in just a bit. But that is where the Irish settlement was, in Oppenheim. So most of the first families, as they were called, to settle in the area came from Ulster, specifically from Tyrone and Donegal via Philadelphia. So they entered through the city and then came north. Their surnames were Fitzpatrick, Fitzgerald, Starr, Tomney, Gleason, Donnelly, and Ward. And it is a little blurry, but on the map, you can actually see Donnelly, you could see Starr, you could see Ward. So these families were still here when this map was drawn. They were followed by family members and neighbors who would purchase subdivided lots from the larger tracts owned by the original settlers. So those original families bought these large tracts of land and then subdivided them off and sold them to people who were coming over, their neighbors, their family members, their friends. The new arrivals isolated themselves from their non-Irish neighbors, attempting to recreate life in rural Ireland with this insular community that became known as the Irish settlement. And the first two generations actually married within the settlement itself, so they did not marry outside of this location. By 1875, the Irish community in western Fulton County was well established. It was a primarily agricultural settlement. Their farms grew potatoes and other vegetables, buckwheat, oats, and hay. These were harvested for consumption as well as for market. There was a small scale dairying industry. Cheese factories were a big thing in Western Fulton County during this time. So a lot of that dairy would go on to the cheese factories and would be sold actually over in Little Falls, which was one of the major cheese markets in New York. Go figure, right? And would help to bring an income for the farmers. They also had sheep, pigs, hens, and geese. Families supplemented their diets and incomes by hunting and fishing, selling skins and pelts, and the women carded and spun wool from their sheep, which was picked up by Eli Yanni, who owned a small mill in nearby Ephrata, where he used that yarn to make mittens. So this is just the historic marker showing where the Yanni mill was located. And he would come to the settlement, get the yarn, and bring it back to his factory. Other major industries included logging, which the men had been engaged with from the start, of course, out of necessity to clear the land. The area was also rich with hemlock trees, and that was the bark that was needed for tanning hides. Hemlock bark contains tannins, which is necessary for the process. And so the bark would be stripped from the trees and sold to nearby tanneries like Ledoux's, which was located at Dolgeville. In the wintertime, men of the settlement would go to Stewart's Landing for seasonal work, and the families traded in shops in Lascellsville and Middle Sprite, and merchants also traveled to the settlement to conduct business. So they also had people that were coming to them. The eastern side of the settlement was served by 3 shops, 2 churches, a Methodist church and a Union church, a hotel, and, as I said, a cheese factory. The western part had a shop, a sawmill, butter tub factory, and a dozen dwelling houses. The community also had its own school called the Union Star School. I would love to find an image of this. We have a gentleman named Michael Gendron who does research on Fulton County schools and rural schools. And so I'm hoping maybe someday he'll be able to find an image of that. Teachers would actually come from nearby towns mostly to teach, and they would board with the families because it was such a distance to travel. Although, as you can see here, Owen Starr, who is one of the sons of the earlier settlers, did teach at the Irish Settlement School. In 1875, St. Bridget's Catholic Church and Cemetery were built. That was the RC, the Roman Catholic Church that was on the map. It was actually an outmission of St. Mary's in Little Falls, and the settlement itself had about 20 families, but the church also served 40 or more families from the surrounding area, so they were all coming to this church. St. Bridget's was one of the earliest Catholic churches in Fulton County. Larkin and Casey described the settlement as, quote, an oasis of Irish Roman Catholics occupying tracts of loamy scrubland in a district otherwise German and English Protestant. The church served as an epicenter of religious and social life for the community. Holidays and funerals were large community gatherings. Ceilidhs were common and included dancing, music, games, letter reading, storytelling, and of course, local gossip. These later parties also included baseball and quilting. So I can imagine the whole community getting together for these social events and having a lot of fun with music and playing games and things like that. But unfortunately, the community was not to last. Younger generations who had been born in America started to marry outside of the community, and they were seeking opportunities in nearby Herkimer, Little Falls, St. Johnsville, and other cities and towns in the Mohawk Valley. Lumbering became less profitable. Tanneries started substituting hemlock bark with new chemical methods for tanning. Farming was becoming more competitive with westward expansion. And in 1900, the mission at St. Bridget's was transferred to St. Patrick's in St. Johnsville. It's a lot of saints. The parish was eventually dissolved in the 1930s and the building was torn down. The cemetery with its 45 burials remained behind. Today, there is not much left of the settlement, maybe some stone foundations and cemetery, but there is an Irish settlement road that is really kind of the only named thing that remains of that area. People in Fulton County have always been and are still proud of their Irish heritage and have tried to preserve it. In the mid 20th century, Johnstown had its own AOH chapter. This has since dissolved, but we do still have local people who join the chapters in Saratoga and Albany. So they're traveling, but they're going. The Catholic population of Johnstown also grew so extensively that the city alone had 3 Catholic churches, and each of them mostly served different nationalities. So there was St. Patrick's for Irish, St. Anthony's for the Slovaks, and Immaculate Conception, which was mostly an Italian congregation. Today, these churches have been consolidated into one, which is now called Holy Trinity Church, and they do still worship at the former St. Patrick's Church. But there's no doubt that immigrants have built Fulton County, and the Irish have certainly played an important role in our history and are present today. So that's the end of my official presentation. This is just some information about us. We are open. We just opened this past weekend. We're open weekends in June from 12 to 4, and then you can see our hours expand once we hit July. We're closed the 4th of July. There is no admission fee. We'd love to come and have you come and see our special exhibit on immigration and all of the other great displays that we have. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer what I can.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I'm trying to figure out how to unspotlight you. But so yeah, that was fantastic. You know, you forget how early some of the Irish come over. My light is probably bad. How early some of the Irish come to this country and are involved, you know. And it's also strange hearing about loyalist Irish in the war, the Revolutionary War. Although of course, you know, they occurred. But normally, well, not normally, but, you know, when I was looking at Irish in the city, a lot of them were able to kind of divide their fortunes. And so, like, one brother will stay on one side of the, you know, but these poor Johnsons seem to have really nailed their colours to the mast. So there was no getting out of it.
Definitely.
Yeah. And so how industrial was it? You know, while we wait for people online, absolutely use this Q&A feature here or the chat, you know, just hover over it. How industrialized did it become, you know, in the district with those factories that you were talking about?
It was definitely mostly rural. Obviously they were doing a lot of lumbering and they were the cheese factories, and of course a lot of industries sprung out from those, like the butter tub factories and the cheese tub factories. So it was, I would say, you know, when you think of a rural community, it was surprisingly industrial, I guess, for what you might imagine.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, there's so much movement in when you show that map of how, in a way, how close everything is, even though, you know, in those days travel was harder. But like, this is a busy town. Is that the town behind you?
This is Gloversville.
Yeah. So that's a big town, I guess.
It was, yes.
Okay, good. And so with it's interesting how he manages, or I don't know, but, you know, he's got slaves or enslaved people. He's got, you know, the native people that he's trying to kind of placate, sometimes that he's married into. Did you say his wife was a common law wife with him, or, you know, how official was that marriage?
Yes, it was a common law marriage. Yeah. I think they did have a Mohawk ceremony, but that was it.
Okay, and so when you were saying she fled, like, obviously she couldn't stay to inherit anything then, or, you know.
Right, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
She actually, Molly Brandt is a really fascinating person. There is a book that was put out about her. Of course, now I can't remember the name of it, but if you just search Molly Brandt online, you will find tons of really information. She's fascinating.
Well, and, you know, she wrote her name and stuff. That's very, you know, she obviously was educated to some extent, you know, yeah.
She was a diplomat. I mean, she attended things where she represented her people, and so she was very, very interesting.
Well, and I think, you know, it's interesting too to hear that side of stories, like that, you know, these were negotiations that were happening of the territories, and even after the Canadian War, like, to have to take into account the native allies of Canada. It's not, you know, it's a more complicated and kind of a more sophisticated story, I think, than we sometimes feel, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Johnson descendants, I don't think they've done it recently, but a lot of times they used to come down from Canada, and it was like a big thing in
Oh,
Johnstown. There's some photos from the 70s and 80s, like comparing their pictures to portraits of the
yeah.
Johnsons. So I don't think they've done that recently, but
Right. Well, there's a phrase in the Irish language, Brishan an dúchas tríhíle an cuit, which means, like hereditary will out. And so even down the generations, you'll see someone's nose or
yes.
yeah. Um, Marina just texted. She said, "Thank you. It was a great presentation. Great to hear about County Meath, which is where Pierce Brosnan is from. This is true." And my father-in-law, she said, studied there in the 1920s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Interesting fun fact, there was a really kind of terrible TV movie in the 90s called Broken Arrow that starred Pierce
Oh
Brosnan
yeah,
as Sir William Johnson. So
that's right. Was it horribly inaccurate? I didn't see it, but
the last time I watched it, I think I was in fourth grade, but if you mention it, people are like,
okay, yeah. Or you could do movie night at the museum and just
yeah,
poke
that's
holes.
a great idea.
Yeah. Well, no, it's very fascinating, and I think obviously he was with the Protestant angle. It's interesting too for the Irish because we forget sometimes that the early Irish immigrants were often Protestant, and as you said, often came too from Ulster and made their way down. So that's an interesting trail to have come in from Philadelphia instead of Canada or New York. That yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to do more research into how they got up here. So
Yeah, it must have been kind of arduous in those days, really. I mean, it's one thing to come from New York, up to Albany at least was kind of, doable.
mhm.
But yeah, or even Canada down, is doable. Um, so I don't think anyone else has any questions, and I don't like to, hog the thing, but
Oh, you're fine.
yeah, yeah. And so the museum seems to have an awful lot of artifacts. Like this is fantastic, the artwork and his even the letters, like that kind of stuff is amazing to have been able to keep all of those things.
Yeah,
Um,
so the
mm,
Johnson papers are available in bound volumes online and
oh,
at the New York State Archive, so anybody can look
yeah.
those. They're really interesting to just browse through.
And Samantha, do you know like how did they survive the fact that the family did leave? Kind of you guess in a rush after the revolution. It's amazing in a way that they were preserved.
Yeah, so Sir John Johnson
Mm.
actually came back down several times with raiding parties
Oh,
during the war. Obviously, they never got Johnson Hall back, but he
yeah,
did establish a settlement up in Canada, and that's kind of where they, we for us in Fulton County, once they go to Canada, we're like, okay, the
yeah.
Johnson,
You're gone now. You're not our
goodbye.
territory.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
don't really look into
And do
that
you
history too
know
much.
what happened to the enslaved people at that time? You said his wife took some of, the people with her, but maybe not the slaves necessarily.
Yeah, so some of the enslaved people did go with them, but
Mm.
Wanda Birch, in her researching the slavery at Johnson Hall, found that a small group of them remained behind in Johnstown and actually had a settlement that was there until the early 1900s. But I haven't
Oh,
found a lot of information about that, so I'm
okay.
not sure. But I'm sure they just kind of integrated back into, society here if they stayed.
Yeah. Mike G says, great job, Sam. Yeah, it was very interesting.
Thank you.
When you showed that little, I don't know, was it a diary entry or the letter, and he was talking about the slaves dying of cholera or smallpox.
Smallpox. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, flock is kind of a religious word too. So I was wondering about that, like that, maybe very paternalistic, but like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm worried about my flock, not to paint it with the rosy colored, picture, but he may have been because I mean he seems to the fact that he married a native woman and stuff, there's something more going on than a binary attitude, to
Yeah.
race.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, there's nothing to suggest that he was particularly harsh or anything, but and of course he did have this relationship with the Mohawk, but it was also very like as you said, very
yeah,
complicated. So there's all
yeah,
these kind of undercurrents and undertones
yeah,
in these
yeah.
relationships that are kind of hard to pull out. So
Yeah, and for a man like him, a lot of this relationship would have absolutely been economic. Nicholas Canny does a lot of work on the Atlantic world, as they call it, and if he was a landlord in Meath in Ireland, Protestant landlord, Catholic tenants, a lot of the language is used in the same way, to talk about the Catholics in Ireland in the 15 and 1600s and earlier under British rule or Protestant rule, you know, as later on when they come here, and there's that huge demarcation like between the native peoples, as the, you know, the Irish Celts would have been looked down on as savage, you know. So he's already in that frame of mind, like of a paternalistic landlord, you know, that's governing over people that need to be governed, you know.
Sure.
Pat said, who gained ownership of the buildings and land, Johnson's buildings, after the Revolutionary War?
Great question. The state of New York took over the lands after the war and sold them. They were actually privately owned for many, many years, until it became a state historic site in the 20th century. So it was actually someone's house for quite a long
Oh my God.
time. Yeah.
Imagine, yeah. And I feel like it's incredibly well preserved. So it's amazing that the family like didn't extend or knock down or do something foolish, you know.
There are some photos from the late 1800s, early 1900s of the hall. They did like add things to the building itself, so they had to do a lot of undoing. But you're right that, you know, the main structure was left mostly alone.
Yeah, which is great. Mike says, where did you find the picture of the Irish settlement teacher?
I found that in an article in Irish America about Irish settlement. Mike, I will send that to you.
Yeah. That magazine has great articles. Sometimes I use that myself.
Yeah, it was from 1988. I was like, who's writing about Fulton County in 1988?
Yeah. So Samantha, to turn to kind of a sad, obviously this place is, you know, thriving with money in the 1700s. There's all these landlords. You know, he has such vast amounts of land just from farming, you know, and then the lumber industry, I suppose, was very, you know, generated a lot of wealth. Does it become kind of depressed, you know, after, maybe, I know there's factories and things in some of the bigger towns up there, but, you know, is it still quite agricultural, or what happens to it in the early 20th century in terms of, you know, you were saying even some of these younger ones that like marry outside the settlement, maybe also leave, you know?
Yeah, I think they just, in terms of the Irish settlement, they just didn't have the people there anymore to maintain, you know, they were seeking, I mean, it's the same story, right? You see in all generations of the children of the children going and, you know, leaving. And so I think that it was part of it. And I think I've noticed that story a lot too, while researching for our exhibit on immigration. You get this sort of distance from, you know, your parents' culture, the culture of the homeland, and wanting to be American, and, you know, so.
And was there a lot of like rural depopulation type stuff, or, you know, how, because it seems very busy in the, you know, 1800s.
Yeah, all of Fulton County pretty much has had pretty significant population decline, you know, since, especially after the glove and leather industry sort of stopped in the 70s, 80s. We've lost a lot of population here.
Was it going that long? The 1970s, you mean?
Yes. It's definitely on its last breath by the 1970s.
Oh, that's amazing.
But yeah. I
mean, I'm trying, you know, I'm thinking in terms of Troy's factories. I'm sure I'm not sure, but I assume they didn't make it into the 20th century. You know, like, it's amazing to think of it lasting that long, kind of thing. Yeah. And, you know, it's funny, I suppose, well, COVID, of course, has changed everything, but we saw, you know, the price of property in the Catskills going through the roof and stuff as people fled New York City to come back up, because now, you know, if we're going to be working from home, it might be good for these little towns, you know, maybe there's a fresh injection kind of people that will, you know,
exciting things are happening around here. So.
Well, and I think communities like that band together. So, like, it's, you know, your museum seems like it's going to be really busy for the summer. You know, and you do a lot. I guess there must be people look kind of all year long trying to do research or genealogy type things, you know. Do you open like a reading room or something like that in the off season, or?
Yeah, we have a library, so if people want to make appointments, I welcome appointments any time of year, even if we're not open officially.
Not to make more work for you, like, but
no, I welcome. It's nice to have company.
Good. So thank you very much. I don't think there are any other questions, but that was brilliant. Tomorrow, people know the museum we're going down to the city to see Oh God, the Paradise Square. It's a new musical nominated for 10 Tony Awards about the Irish in 5 Points. The Irish and African Americans in 5 Points. Very, very, notorious slum. But perhaps there was more to the story than meets the eye down there. So I'll give a walking tour of the region first, and then we're going to go to the show. On Thursday, we have a cooking demonstration with our chef Michael Kiernan as part of our Irish cuisine culture, traditions, and innovation series. We're going to be making seafood chowder, even though it's getting a bit hot for chowder now, to be honest. And then on Monday, our film club is back with an Irish language film called Aracht, which is the Irish word for monster, and it's set it's about the Great Hunger. It was an award-winning movie, and we're delighted to get it. Culture Ireland and the Irish film industry sponsored the screening of that. So that's 6 o'clock in the museum. That's in person. But Samantha, thank you so much, everyone. We'll have to visit now. We might do a field trip up there.
Yeah.
I'm saying
we'll come to you. We'll do it.
Yeah, well, we're installing the permanent exhibit, so by September we'll be ready for visitors.
Awesome.
We're open, but don't come yet.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone that was online. And we'll definitely be back. I think I'm speaking to you guys in September.
Yes.
So maybe I'll give a talk about the famine or something. At home in Ireland, it's the 175th anniversary, so we might do something about that. Yeah, and to explain why they left in such numbers. But yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great night. And thank you, Samantha. That was brilliant.
Thank you.